أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين. صدق الله العظيم.
Assalamu alaikum. I greet you all in the name of the Most High. We are gathering virtually because the country and the world are still confronted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Whilst the outlook is improving, there is no denying that the past 20 months have wasted life and ravaged families and livelihoods. We pray that all those families that have been affected are comforted and that their dearly departed rest in eternal peace. I am grateful for the invitation to share a few thoughts in conversation with the congregation of the Claremont Main Road Mosque and in memory of the late Imam Haron. A special thank you to Imam Rashid Omar, who extended the invitation through Brother Kasim Khan of the Imam Haron Foundation. As the congregation will be aware, the 27th of September this year will mark the 52nd anniversary of the passing of the great freedom fighter and martyr, Imam Abdullah Harun. It seems remarkable that a child who was born in the year of his killing would now be 8 years away from retirement, at least early retirement. It therefore feels like an incredibly long time, long enough to produce a generation of grandparents. Yet, the wound that was inflicted on us by his murder is as raw now as it was at the moment of his death. It is fresh not because we are incapable of transcending pain. After all, as a people that are religious, our faith endows us with the ultimate tool to conquer our adversities. In faith, we are assured of healing when we seek refuge in God. Our collective pain persists because despite the grievous violence visited upon his body by his tormentors such as Warrant Officer Hernus Baker van Wyk, despite the incriminating evidence contained in the forensic report that explains his death, the leadership of the free democratic South Africa that his blood nourished has found it undesirable to hold his killers to book. I'm aware that during last year's conversation with my brother Imtiaz Keji, this congregation will have been addressed on the processes that are being taken by the family of Imam Haron that has joined hands with the families of many other victims of apartheid-era atrocities, to bring an end to this astonishing act of betrayal. So for this reason, I will not dwell on that process this year. I must instead focus on the why question. Why it is that the appropriation of responsibility for murder under apartheid is at the core of national reconciliation. First, there is no moral parity between acts committed to uphold an unjust political order and those designed to overthrow it. And I think we will have seen responses from institutions like AfriForum, the de Klerk Foundation, as well as Mr. de Klerk himself, that attempt to make such non-existent parity. It is indeed regrettable that in opting for a negotiated political settlement, this distinction was not upheld by our liberation movement. Apartheid was deemed by the world through the United Nations to be a crime against humanity. For every year between 1952 and 1990, the United Nations condemned apartheid as a violation of its protocols, in particular Articles 55 and Article 56. The General Assembly of the United Nations dubbed apartheid as a crime against humanity through Resolution 2202, which it took in the year 1966. This resolution was later endorsed by the Security Council in 1984. But it is in 1973 that the International Convention was passed on the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid, and this was the furthest reaching denunciation of the crime of apartheid. Among other citations, the 1973 Apartheid Convention in Article 1 states the following. Number 1, it says, the states parties to the present convention declare that apartheid is a crime against humanity and that inhuman acts resulting from the policies and practices of apartheid and similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination, as defined in Article 2 of the Convention, are crimes violating the principles of international law, in particular, the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and constituting a serious threat to international peace and international security. Number 2, it states, the states parties to the present convention declare criminal those organizations, institutions, and individuals committing the crime of apartheid. The Apartheid Convention also provides for criminal action against offenders, including for acts committed on or against foreign territories such as Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, Lesotho, and Swaziland, if such action was in furtherance of apartheid. Therefore, our collective political leadership is directed by international protocols to indict the killers of Imam Haron. With this in mind, the responsibility transfers from the Harun family, who, like others in the apartheid-era victims' family group, are often asked to explain why they are advocating for the prosecution of more than 300 cases so recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It must be said that the onus to respond to this transfers to the authorities and the political leadership, who must explain why something that is recognized by the world as a punishable offense has not been tried in the case of Imam Haron in 52 years. Having explained what must happen about his death, I now want to focus a little more on his life. In my remarks at the Imam Haron lecture last year, I argued, and I quote, "It is important to remember that the value of our fallen beloved does not derive from their death. The Imam is not a hero because he was killed. He was killed precisely because he was a hero. And I may add one that was so rooted in the righteousness of our struggle that he was prepared to die for his people. Therefore, we ought to celebrate him not because he died, but because he lived a life centered in truth and the pursuit of justice. His activism was effective and discomforting that those who were purveyors of injustice would seek relief through his murder. He was guided by his faith and anchored by the teachings of the Prophet Imam. He was guided by his faith and anchored by the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. It is this strong foundation that earns him the esteemed position of Imam at a relatively young age of 32, which comes with the responsibility to lead others in faith, many of whom were substantially older than him in age. Having assented to this role, he did so not by separating his faith and the theory of his faith from the practice of his faith. He understood fully well that one of the core principles of Islam is the practical challenge of leading through good deeds. Accordingly, he used his faith and his office as agency in order to fight the injustices that exist against not only his congregants, but also against communities around him. He built relations with the Colored People's Congress and the Pan-African Congress, and worked extensively in surrounding communities beyond the cultural, religious, and party political lines in order to promote an egalitarian society. These are some of the reflections we had about him starting from last year. Now, there are many lenses through which to examine the contemporary relevance of his kind of leadership, the relevance to today's challenges. And I've opted for one that is most immediate to his congregation, an examination briefly of the very environment in which he made his contribution, the city of Cape Town. I was fortunate enough to spend many years in Cape Town as a student of economics, sociology, and philosophy in the early 1990s. And like many people, I fell in love with the city, its beauty, and the unparalleled harmony between land and water. And when the weather permits and the southeasterlies are asleep, it is arguably one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And when you stand at the edge of the Cape of Good Hope, there is the enchantment that you stand at once at the beginning and at the end of Africa. Yet the city is one of the most deceitful cities in the world. If one views only one side of its face, one will be totally oblivious to the fact that it harbors some of the poorest households in the country, who dwell in the most insecure of structures that they call home. This coexistence between extreme wealth and abject poverty makes Cape Town the showcase of inequality in South Africa. The World Bank measures what economists call the Gini coefficient, the gap between the rich and the poor, and South Africa rates as the most unequal society in the world, slightly ahead of Brazil which has similar patterns. It's not difficult to imagine that 52 years after his death, the Imam would condemn that his country and his communities are flag bearers of inequality, as if our humanity is divisible. The second characteristic of the city is the endemic culture of violence. This culture is interwoven into the culture of drug trafficking and territoriality. If you conduct an online search under the query mega capitals of the world, you will be unnerved by the result. Tijuana in Mexico is the most murderous city in the world per capita, so per 100,000 people. Cape Town, South Africa, is the most murderous capital in the world by death toll. So in other words, it has the highest number of deaths recorded than any other city in the world. This congregation will know that the concentration of this violence is in the poorest communities. These are communities that were of concern to Imam Haron, and that should be of concern to us all. In these communities, mothers release their children into the streets for them to attend school and other youthly activities, with more probability here in the city than anywhere else in the world that they will return home in a body bag. This culture has existed for many years, yet those in leadership have failed to attend to the vulnerability of our communities. It is a constitutional crisis that there are thousands of people who are members of these communities who cannot enjoy the rights promised to us by our Constitution. The Bill of Rights, which is central to our Constitution, recognizes two rights in the extreme. The first is the right to life, and the other, the right to human dignity. It asks the question, what extent should each of these rights and many others listed in the Bill of Rights be protected? And when it comes to life and to human dignity, it answers the question thus: they are inviolable. The last feature I want to bring to the fore in respect of Cape Town is its long-standing tradition as a home of diversity. Its foundation is based on the fusion of the Khoi and the San people, and the culture of the Dutch and the Malay, and many others that came along thereafter. Indeed, it remains to this day one of the most diverse cities in our country. Apart from gender and age, religion and race, there are of course cultural and political factors that are at play and that maketh the city of Cape Town. And as far as I'm aware, the city has embraced this diversity with relative success, albeit that there are simmering tensions along its many fault lines from time to time. I raise this diversity issue not as a problem, but as an opportunity. The genius of Imam Haron was in understanding that the construction of democracy necessitates embracing diversity as a building block. Apartheid South Africa was never a democracy. Therefore, after 1994, we ought to have struggled with participatory democracy. Yet, because of the activism of people like Imam Haron, who focused on building the infrastructure for our democracy, starting at a community level, we became one of the most promising young democracies in terms at least of how communities have raised their voices. As we remember Harun, I want to invite us to follow his example. Commemorations must become more than just a collection of single-day narratives. They must become more than a recital of biographies of our martyrs. The ultimate justice for the murder of Imam Haron lies in the attainment of the objectives for which he fought. Harun took his activism beyond the walls of the mosque in order to elevate the voice of our people. Our people have spoken for 27 years. They will again go soon to the polls to raise their collective voice by electing new local leadership. Those of us who possess faith must, like the Imam, take our faith to the street. We must take it to the homes of the vulnerable and the destitute to provide hope and a helping hand to those in need. We must take it to the communities that are beset with violence in order to silence the guns. If needs be, we must take it to the highest courts of the land, through class action, to compel those who are tasked with governance to deliver to our people the promise of our freedom. But what we cannot do is to tap out. We cannot respond with impotence to the mission before us and then still call ourselves people of faith. Let us be inspired by the memory of this great son of our soul. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the dispenser of grace. Ya Rabbal Alameen, O Lord of the universe, you created all human beings from the same essence and breathe of your spirit into each one of us. Help us to affirm the full dignity and honor of all human beings, no matter their skin colors. Ya Rabban Nas, O Lord of all humankind, we pray for all of those who have died at the hands of police and military personnel for no reason other than the color of their skin. Ya Rabb al-Qist, O Lord of compassionate justice, in our struggle to dismantle racism and the institutions and systems that keep racism alive, grant us the grace and strength to rid ourselves of the bias and hatred that oppress some of us while providing entitlement to others. Ya Rabb al-Quwwa, O Lord of power, help us to understand the ways we benefit from privilege and power so that we may be allies in the struggle for racial justice who are thoughtful and effective. We stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and we pray for all who dedicate their lives to breaking down the race and class barriers in our communities. Ya Rabb as-Salam, O Lord of peace, you are the ultimate source of all peace and justice. We ask you to hear our prayers, to look with compassion on our world, and to unite us in bonds of love and solidarity. Nas'aluka bi asma'ika al-husna, and we ask this in all of your beautiful and holy names. Ya Rabb al-Nas, O Lord of all humankind, wa Rabb al-Mustad'afin, and Lord of the oppressed and the marginalized. Allahumma Ameen.